Hello, and welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, Quilt National 2025, which is produced and circulated by the Dairy Barn Arts Center in Athens, Ohio. Today, we are thrilled to present the artist Anthony Bowman. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in is in listen-only mode. Feel free to utilize that chat function to ask questions, and I'll be sure to get to them at the end of the talk. And keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there might be variation of bandwidth, or if one of us freezes up, thank you in advance for bearing with us. All right, welcome, Anthony.
Oh, thank you, Kat. And I just want to thank the Ohio Arts Council for this opportunity. I'm from Ohio. I went to college in Ohio. I did move away for 25 years and recently moved back. And I'm excited to have a chance to share a little bit about what I was doing while I was away, but most importantly, my evolution from a maker of utility quilts to art. So I'll just jump in. So I grew up near Darbydale, which is a small town just southwest of Columbus. This is me with my younger brother Noah, so named because of my mother's love of animals. We're in the backyard. I love all the spring ephemerals in this photo. My mother was a school teacher. She's retired now. Growing up, our home was always full of activity, arts, and crafts. This is Noah painting pumpkins and gourds. To be honest, I was probably about 14 at this time and likely considered myself way too cool for such activities. But Noah showed a lot of artistic talent when he was younger and ended up going to the Columbus College of Art and Design to earn a Bachelor's of Fine Arts. I mentioned that my mother loved animals. This is an important part of my childhood. There are lots of household pets. There were lots of household pets growing up. Dogs, cats, rabbits. There are many pictures of us with animals in the backyard. Well, many of those photos are simple family snapshots. My mother enjoyed photography as a hobby when I was younger. There are more stylized photos with animals in the backyard, like this one, and pictures taken at local parks. I particularly love the reflection in this photo. It makes me think of the repetition in quilts. Her photography extended into the garden as well. She took photos of plants, both those that were intentionally planted and those that grew naturally on their own accord. Many of these photos are up close shots that capture details. This is something I would do later when observing the world around me. Most of the animals we had growing up were rescues. My mother volunteered at a local humane society and would bring home abused and neglected animals. This rabbit survived the gas chamber at the shelter twice. My mother brought him home and named him Marigold. 1983, my mom founded the Ohio Humane Education Association, or OHIA, creating a way to share her respect and love for animals with others. OHIA taught elementary children how to humanely treat animals, both household pets and wildlife. The organization was all volunteer run, and my mother continued to teach full time. OHIA quickly expanded into advocacy, for example, public education campaigns about pet overpopulation. I've talked a lot about OHIA because I can't help but connect the compassion my mother taught me for animals and the advocacy she engaged in as influencing my own career. In the mid-90s, I left home for college. I attended Antioch in Yellow Springs, Ohio. Antioch is a college focused on social justice education. The school motto, be afraid to die until you have won some victory for humanity. This is me in my dorm room on graduation day being very contemplative, or at least pretending that I'm being contemplative. While at Antioch, I had completed internships in Miami, New Orleans, and San Francisco, experiencing life in cities for the first time. After graduating from college, I moved to Chicago because I wanted life in bigger cities. In Chicago, I would begin a 25-year career that continues today, focusing on community organizing and coalition-based social justice initiatives. While I was away from Ohio, my mother and Noah built Ohia into the Ohio SPCA. They put an end to inhumane gassing in Ohio shelters, which is illegal statewide now because of their work, and established a farm sanctuary for abused and neglected farm animals. The sanctuary continues to run and is currently home to horses, cows, pigs, goats, sheep, and more. Noah unexpectedly passed away in 2019, and it's the impact of his passing and a desire to be closer to family that brought me back to Ohio a couple years ago. Prior to that move back home, and after living in Chicago, two cities in China, and DC, I landed in New York City in 2016. This is when I started quilting. I'd rented a spare bedroom from my friend Greer, who's the friend of a good friend from, or the sister of a good friend from college. This spare bedroom doubled as Greer's quilting studio, and I became absolutely fascinated by the fabrics, their colors and textures. So Greer taught me the basics, even gave me some fabric, and let me use one of her sewing machines. This picture is of my first sewing space. Nothing fancy, very utilitarian. Which brings me to my early quilts. Now, these early quilts were not things that I conceived of as art, although I did create them with meaning and intent. Several have hung in quilt shows, been featured in publications, and one even won a ribbon, to my surprise. But most are in use in my home because that's what I made them for. This is a photo of the finished top for my first quilt. It was completed in 2018 and has been on my bed ever since. Creativity wasn't something I had previously had an outlet for, although I've always thought of my work as an organizer and coalition builder to be a creative endeavor, you know, finding ways to bring people together for a common purpose or cause. But it wasn't the same as making something with my hands, especially something that had utility. And I was hooked virtually right away. A couple of photos showing the quilting on my first quilt. This is Color Wheel Emotion. I think this might be my third piece. The design references the movement inherent in the shape of a color wheel, which takes us on a journey of the emotions and feelings that colors and their different values stir in us as we transition from one hue to the next. But this color wheel has been pulled apart and reformed into twisting and overlapping pathways, which, as I was piecing this, reminded me of memories from childhood. Board games, roller coasters, trains, trails in the woods behind my house, some detail photos. All of these memories are also colorful and emotional, and they suggest movement. For example, game pieces moving towards a goal or trains or roller coasters on their tracks. With color wheel emotion, I begin to play with gradations and color and value that create an ombre-like effect. And this is an aesthetic that would characterize a lot of these earlier utility quilts. This is puzzle pieces. It is composed of improg log cabin blocks um, that have traditional quilt block shapes figuratively cut from their centers. So, for example, there's like sawtooth star, churn dash, bear's paw. And these pieces that have been cut out are now floating in the negative space near the blocks, creating puzzle pieces that could be figuratively cut into the figuratively placed into the corresponding log cabin. It makes me think of that game Perfection that I played when I was a kid, where you had all these pieces you had to fit into the right slot. Um, some detail photos. This is a style, these are traditional blocks, but they're presented in a very modern way. They're not in a grid, they're not uniform in shape and size. They use more vibrant colors. It's a reinterpretation of traditional quilt designs that's often referred to as modern traditionalism, and is also very common in my earlier quilts. This is overlapping geese number one, the first of several quilts I made using this original design. There is a strong sense of pattern making in this design that I really enjoy, more so than in my previous quilts, where a single shape, in this case a trapezoid, is repeated over and over and over again. Overlapping geese is also a modern traditionalist design. It is a new interpretation of the flying geese block. The traditional flying geese block pictured here is usually just an individual rectangle with a triangle that represents a single goose's body. They're frequently sewn into rows like this. Some say that the triangle also represents or references the V shape that geese fly in when migrating. But in this design, they're called overlapping geese because the body of each goose overlaps the goose in front of it. They're in a hurry, I guess. Here is a second version in grayscale. With this quilt, I started being more conscious of playing with contrast, not just of value, but contrast in texture, or rather perceived texture, by using pattern fabrics with varying motifs and different scales. This perceived visual texture creates a different experience for the viewer depending on how far or close they are from the quilt. So here's an example. When viewed up close, the quilt is rich with the details of over 80 fabrics, the majority with patterns that range from tone on tone, or for example, gray on gray, to black and white patterns that have more contrast. But from further back, these details melt away, and you see gradations in value and more near nuanced variations in texture that flow within and between the columns of geese. And this visual perception is, of course, you know, common in a lot of different forms of art. Another overlapping geese quilt. I chose a much larger scale for this one and opted for a 45-degree orientation. And I only use solid fabrics, which gives the geese a much more geometric and modern look. Some detail images. Overlapping geese number three was actually the first of my quilts to be submitted and accepted to a quilt show. It hung at QuiltCon 2022 in Phoenix. So this is not a quilt. This is the Huangpu River in downtown Shanghai. So before I go into my next phase of quilting, where I started to think about quilts less as utilitarian objects and more as art to be displayed on a wall, I want to backtrack and talk a little bit about my time in China and how some of my experiences there and photos I took connect to quilting, at least in my mind. So beginning in 2009, I spent 3 years in China. The first year was in Shanghai, where I taught English at a university. The second year, I taught English at a high school in Qiqihar. Qiqihar is a much smaller city than Shanghai. It's located in China's northeast, about midway between North Korea and Russia. My time in Qiqihar was the heart of my immersion experience, as I quickly built a routine and sense of community in the city. There's photos of class outside, I think in the fall. Part of this community is my friendship with Wang Chi. He's a very interesting character. He taught military history during the day at a university, but 6 nights a week taught drawing and ran a studio space for students. And we had a student in common, which is how we ended up meeting. These are pictures of that studio. He's trying to get me to draw. At the time, I wasn't having any of it. 6 evenings a week, I would spend 3 to 4 hours in Wang Chi's studio. He didn't speak any English, but this was my second year in China, and my Chinese was decent at that point. Our conversations were a little strained at first, but he would use simple language to explain, body language to explain, sometimes even pull out pen and paper and draw things. Um, he was, in a sense, my Chinese teacher, to be honest. I also became an honorary member of a family that ran a corner market. They were my brother, sister-in-law, auntie, and niece. After leaving Wang Chi's studio, I would head to the market and spend 3 hours or more there before heading home, sometimes as late as 1 in the morning. Like with Wang Chi, my interactions with the Zhang family were entirely in Chinese. And needless to say, my language skills really skyrocketed during this time. I even started dreaming in Chinese. I joined family dinners and outings. This photo was taken with my niece on the river that flowed through downtown Chichihar and which froze over in winter. It's probably negative 24 degrees Celsius that day. This is a photo with students helping to clear snow from neighborhood sidewalks. So where I lived, the school that I taught, Wang Chi Studio, the corner market, and a dozen other places where I built connections were all within a few blocks of one another. And this created a very strong sense of community and belonging. And it was, granted, probably more exciting than communities I've been part of here at home, just because of that cultural change element and the language learning. But community is something that's important to me. Um, both the stuff that grows organically, just as part of our lives, and things that you try to create with more intent through organizing or coalition work. The interesting thing is, quilting historically has also been a communal activity. And the process of making a quilt, I feel, is actually an analogy for community building, where you're taking all these different pieces that have their own unique traits and putting them together to create something bigger and connecting them by common threads, quite literally. My third and final year in China was spent traveling all over the country. I have never and probably will never again have such a rich travel experience. After 2 years of studying the language and learning the culture, I felt comfortable going everywhere. Language was not a barrier, at least not the barrier it could have been. I went to big cities, of course, because I love cities, but also small towns. Spent lots of time hiking around the countryside. I took a lot of photos during this year of travel. Many reflected a trend in picture taking I've enjoyed since I got my first digital camera. Here is an example. I love taking photos of what I called digits or units, repetitive shapes, colors, none unlike the patterns or repetition that you see in many quilts. Here's another example. Both of these were taken in Chinese markets. I have similar photos from earlier travels and everyday life. In hindsight, these photos and some of the ones I'm going to show you in just a moment show that I was observing the world with an artist's eye, even though I hadn't started quilting yet, or let alone started thinking of myself as an artist. Another trend in picture taking, I loved capturing texture. I take a photo of something from further back, then move in closer and take another one, then closer still. Remember my mother's detailed photos of plants. I loved capturing the detailed textures of items. These, I believe, are a temple in Thailand. More texture photos, these of a temple in Cambodia. I look back at these photos and I think it's a lot like that overlapping geese grayscale quilt where you see all these details up close, move back further, and it's more nuanced variation in texture and value. I was also obsessed with Chinese characters. I find them absolutely fascinating and beautiful. I studied nearly 3,000 during my time in China, and whether handwritten or etched in stone like they are in this photo, or printed, I absolutely love the shapes of the strokes and the shapes that are created around those strokes. And I learned probably 12 years later that this is not unlike a foundational concept in art called figure ground. And figure ground is everywhere, not just in things made by people, but in the natural world, if you know what to look for and paying attention. But so it wasn't until I started quilting when in New York City that this way of observing the world took on a new, more conscious meaning and found an outlet. Here I am having a moment with a mosaic mural in the DeKalb subway station in Brooklyn. So back to quilts. After quilting for a few years, I became interested in exploring quilts as art. One of my earliest influences was Tim Natar. There's a bold use of color and even whimsy in her quilts, which are often rich in the use of patterned fabrics like this one. Of particular interest to me were her map quilts. I have always loved maps. I have quite a few that I've used to cover entire walls in my apartments over the years. This one's in Chicago. Here's my apartment, my kitchen in Brooklyn. These are not fancy maps. Some are just street maps I used to navigate before Google Maps was a thing, and we all had computers in our pockets. Others are places I've traveled to. I have a lot of maps that are actually in Chinese of places I visited or lived in China. So I decided to take Timna's map making workshop, and at the time, she recommended selecting fabrics to represent different features on a map, such as land, water, roads, or parks. I prepared for this, but after making an applique of New York City's rivers, decided to use my selected fabrics to make a striped background to serve as the land. While heading home on the subway that night, it occurred to me that those stripes could be the colors of a pride flag, which led to a series of wall quilts and digital quilt patterns on my website titled Communities of Pride. First in the series is Midwest Pride. Here you have two symbols of community, and this holds true for all pieces in this series. First, a map-like feature, in this case, the Great Lakes. And second, a pride flag, a symbol of community, not of space or geography, but of shared identities. By bringing the two together, the series posits what it means to live in a community where everyone is full of pride for their LGBTQ neighbors. Some detail photos. You may have noticed that there are two buttons on the quilt. The one shown here is the approximate location of Chicago, where I lived for 8 years. And the second is located over central Ohio, where I'm from. Besides being the start of a new series, Midwest Pride was the first quilt where I used upcycled clothes or repurposed clothes, specifically family clothing. All of the fabrics except for the Great Lakes applique are family clothes. The black and brown are pants my maternal grandfather wore to a vacuum repair and sales shop he owned for 20 years. The red, dark blue, and purple shirts from my brother. The pink and white gingham came from my mother. The orange and green were shirts of mine that I used to wear around on spring days in DC. And the backing were leftover bandanas that were sold at a fundraiser for the Ohio SPCA for dogs and cats. But all of these fabrics contain memory. When I look at or feel the orange and green fabric from those shirts that I wore around DC, I can actually remember more clearly what it felt like to walk around those neighborhoods on warm spring days. And quilting with upcycled and repurposed materials continues to fascinate me for this reason. So this is Communities of Pride New York City, second in the series. I was living in New York City when I made this one. I particularly love this photo because it shows the quilting texture so well. These quilting lines mimic the city streets. They're denser in some areas where the population is more concentrated, less dense in others. This quilt is actually hanging in an exhibition here, a Sakwa Studio Art Quilt Associates exhibition titled By Contrast, which featured members of the New York and New Jersey chapter. So the contrast in communities of pride is figurative. It's the contrast between the ideal of living in a city where all are accepting of difference in contrast to the reality. Some detailed photos. On the left, you can see ferry lines that have been quilted into New York Harbor that go to Ellis Island, Liberty Island, Governor's Island, Staten Island, and South Brooklyn. Communities of Pride Chicago. This quilt includes the outline of the city and crosshatch or checkerboard patterned quilting, if you will, that mimics the city's street grid. And it includes the city's elevated train system, the Chicago L, which has been appliqued on using bias tape. Detail photos, L trains on the city's south side on the left, and the right, the blue line that terminates at O'Hare Airport in the city's northwest corner. So this is Communities of Pride houses. Now the final two quilts in this series diverge away from the use of map-like elements to symbolize communities of space and instead use houses, which suggest communities of a family, an individual home. And when thinking about groupings of homes, the idea of a community that you might find on a street or a block or in a neighborhood. Communities of Pride houses, like Midwest Pride, also makes use of repurposed textiles and family clothes. Virtually all the fabric in this quilt was either clothing, some came from family, some were thrifted, some were found textiles, or they were scraps from my previous quilts or that were given to me by friends. But all of them tell a story, and I cataloged the source of all these fabrics as I made each house because I wanted to remember. I'm laughing because yes, there is a spreadsheet that accompanies this quilt, but it was important to me to document that part of the process. So this is Home Isn't Always Where the Heart Is. It is written as a statement, not a title. I do consider it a part of the Communities of Pride series, but it doesn't speak to an ideal about inclusion for queer people. Instead, it reflects a colder reality. This piece has been quilted and the edging finished, but it is a work in progress. I'm still gathering buttons, and I'll explain what those buttons mean in a moment. So you have three types of houses in this piece. First are 75 pride houses. It's the two red ones at the top of this example. In these houses, the printed side of the fabric faces outwards, and buttons have been added to represent doorknobs. This outward facing fabric and these buttons symbolize that these homes are open and welcoming to queer family members. Second, you have 39 shame houses in the quilt. This is the lower right house in this example. Here, the houses have been pieced with the wrong side of the fabric facing outwards. They are dull in color, a pale shadow of what is on the other side, or the inside of the house, if you will. They're withholding. Their doorknobs are missing. These are homes where families stigmatize their queer kin or have turned their backs on them entirely. Finally, you have what I call hope houses, the house in the lower left. Here, the house has been pieced with the colorful side of the fabric facing outward, and there is a button for a doorknob, but it's not as colorful as those on the pride houses. The sky and door are pieced backwards, and these are homes that are changing, where family are overcoming prejudices and biases for the sake of loved ones. So the next chapter of my quilt making, and this is where I really started to think about quilts as art and to start thinking of myself as an artist. I think this best describes the direction I'm moving in and what I'm most excited about. And it also marks the beginning of a more formal arts education and practice that I continue to grow and develop in. Before I share my works, I want to talk about two influences. The first is Barbara Danzy. Barbara is an art quilter who is now based in LA, but previously we were both members of the same guild in New York City. Barbara makes beautiful figure ground compositions. Here's an example. She was instrumental in convincing me to take a workshop with Nancy Crow. She's also been very helpful in other ways, lots of tips and tricks on technique in my work. Which brings me to Nancy Crow. Nancy is also an Ohio artist, and she was a leading figure in the art quilt movement in the 70s and a co-founder of Quilt National. This photo is of my design wall in the first workshop I took with her when I was working on some line studies. So important to note, Nancy does not teach quilting. She teaches art, figure ground composition. She encourages her students to think about cutting fabric with a rotary cutter, not using a ruler, because your hand needs to be evident in the work that you're making, as drawing, much the way you would draw with a pencil or even paint with a paintbrush. You know, textiles just happen to be her medium. This is a picture of Nancy's teaching space in a restored timber frame barn. Yeah, her workshops are run much like classes in formal arts education. There are design exercises that set parameters so students can explore a principle, and there are honest critiques of work as well. Her workshops are energizing and full of community. She's built an amazing community of artists through the workshops that she hosts. So this is Scrap Maze. I started this quilt before I started studying with Nancy and finished it afterwards. I would consider it a kind of it and the next piece to be sort of transition pieces, bridging old styles of quilting with new ones. This quilt does not have great figure ground composition. There isn't enough tension or dynamic interaction between the figures, which in this case would be the pathways of the maze, or the grounds or the background, the light gray background that you see. And I did use a ruler. However, I did start paying more attention to saturation in color with this piece. So sections of this maze have fabrics that are muted or low in saturation. There are areas where the fabrics are higher in saturation, brights, almost neon in some cases. And there are areas where saturation falls into a middle or more relative range. And all of this impacts how you see depth when looking at the piece. So this is encounters number one. This piece and potential series each feature two shapes or characters that have an encounter. Both exist in the same space, but still seem to inhabit different worlds. The viewer can decide what the dynamics of their interaction are about. I have my own ideas. Others have told me what they think, but I leave it up to the viewer to interpret. Encounters was a paper collage before it was translated into fabric. The collage is on the left, and the beginnings of the fabric piece on the right. It did still use templates to make this piece. I think that was because I had made a collage and at the time felt like a need to translate things um, accurately from the original design into the fabric piece that I was creating. I've let go of that in subsequent work, but that was what I was doing at the time. And these are two more potential pieces in the series, both made in paper collage. I'm not sure when or if I will make them. As you'll see shortly, I'm leaning towards putting more information into my abstract pieces. So this is Untitled number one. I have not settled on a title for this series, and I might not. With some of these abstract pieces, um, I don't feel a strong name to read them, maybe because I want the viewer to have more leeway in interpretation. Um, that being said, I see aliens when I look at this piece, some of these complex configurations. Um, some detailed photos. Now, in this quilt, I've completely stopped using rulers. I did not touch a ruler when making this except to square it up to actually quilt it. And that was a big, long, like 6 foot metal ruler that I got at a hardware store. But all figures and shapes are drawn by hand with a rotary cutter. And if I didn't like the shape, I drew it again. So when creating abstract pieces, and this is something that Nancy taught in her courses, I first sketch out the idea in black fabric to develop the figure ground composition. So that's the image on the right. Then I begin to add color more intuitively. I am no longer using gradations in color or value in my work. I like the color to be more intermixed and intermingled. I'll just select a few colors at a time to put in some figures and work outward from there. Sometimes going back and making changes based on choices that were made later. This is Untitled number three. You'll notice that I didn't worry about lines lining up directly where one figure connects to another. This is another thing that I'm learning to undo from more traditional quilt making, where you have to worry about all these fussy points matching. I find it so tedious, and I find this way of working more organically and letting things flow much more freeing. And I think it adds another element to the piece as well. It adds more character to the shapes. Some detail photos. And a comparison of the two pieces. I mentioned all of these were cut freehand. I did not use templates to recreate the figures in each piece. Instead, figures are redrawn every time. And this allows for further exploration of the shapes and even surprises as figure and ground shapes evolve. I also opted to carve up the ground in different ways in the two pieces, creating new figures. This is drawing, tentatively titled drawing. I'm calling it drawing because as I was making it, the idea that I was drawing with a rotary cutter really hit me over the head. And I think it's because of all the long vertical lines that extend up and down the piece, even though they are interrupted by reversals in color and value, you still see that line continuing, which creates movement in the work. I find these less grid-based compositions more freeing. They are challenging to sew together, I will say that, but in a very enjoyable way. I like a challenge. And I feel I have some decent spatial organizing skills, some detail photos. Yeah, like when I'm creating these compositions like this and not relying on repetitive pattern, my whole brain feels engaged in the work, which is why I think I'm finding it so much more satisfying than quilting that I've done before. The challenge of creating dynamic figure ground tension, a freer use of hue, value, and saturation, a much, much more diverse use of those things, and the challenge of construction. I don't think I could go back to a more uniform, repetitive way of working. Definitely turned a page in my work. And that brings me to a close. You can find me on Instagram at Anthony Quilts. I have a gallery and shop with digital patterns on my website, and the website also has a contact page if you'd like to reach out. Thank you.
All right, Anthony, thank you so much. Folks, if you have questions, drop them into the chat. Um, of course, comments about impressive work. Linda is curious about those little bits of paper with notes that are on the more recent work. So you included within your in progress pieces, like the areas where there were little notes pinned with paper. Could you chat about that a little bit?
Could I go back to the slide that I think she's referring
Of
to?
course.
Um, is it this one?
I think it's before that one, actually. I think it's where you did your first, like the two um, forms interacting with each other. It was like that one.
Oh, yeah. So I mentioned I made templates for this, and so that was just me labeling the template numbers.
All right.
Um,
There you
yeah.
go, Linda. All right. So you really span the gamut in quilting, um, between your grid-based or very planned and templated versus the improvisational work. You can pop your last slide up so that we can see the Instagram if you want. Um, Tell me a little bit about what it is that you enjoy most about those two different ways.
Yeah, I'm trying to get my screen share back on. Sorry, I lost it by accident.
No worries.
Um, so while I'm about to pull it up now, could you repeat that question for me, please?
Sure. I'm curious because you have such like uh almost diametrically opposed bodies of work with the very, very grid-based, super tight um works versus your improvisational works. And I'm curious how each kind of affects each other and what you enjoy most about both of those arenas.
Yeah, I think one of the things, yeah, I don't know how they affect each other. I think I think one way they've affected each other is that I started learning to quilt more in the way a traditional quilter would learn, sort of as craft.
Hmm.
Although I do think all quilts are art, or at least historical artifacts. I mean, there's so many quilts that have been made that we look back on. They contain history and culture. But I definitely learned it more as craft and was following patterns, or at least traditional things that designs that quilters have been doing for generations. And as I've transitioned more into art and thinking of quilts as a medium for art, I've had to unlearn a lot of that. And I sometimes feel drawn back to it a little bit. Um, so like those transition pieces where I was starting to use color and figure ground composition a little bit, but still relying on rulers or templates. Um, yeah.
So the skill carries forward, obviously, because while you're not cutting, or drawing out with a ruler, it does require a skill to join those pieces, even if they don't align. In fact, probably a little more difficult to, get those little bits that protrude that don't exactly line up.
Yeah. When I first started sewing curves, my head hurt because I was used to just straight line sewing, like a straight seam. But now I just find it so engaging and so easy. It is, I mean, like this image, this piece right here, that large pink arc is probably maybe 30 inches wide and almost 2 feet high. Does create it's a whole new challenge when it comes to precision. Um, but again, I have this good spatial order in my head so I can really plan out how to piece things together most effectively. I sometimes get a little stuck and I'm like, oh gee, how am I going to do this? But it all comes together.
So I'm curious in that, what is it that draws you into or settles you within a composition for these improvisational? So when you're in a more grid-based quilt, where things are going to be, and the fun of that is moving around the
Mhm.
values to describe the other shapes that you would get here by creating the shapes. So I'm curious, how are you settling into? I know you do the black and white, but like talk us through a little bit of that improvisation. How are you getting here?
Yeah, I mean, so the black and white, I mean, first, before I even start working with color, that figure ground tension has to be good. Um, and sometimes I'm looking at some a composition, and you have to stop and study it. Like when it's not working, when it's not dynamic. When every piece and corner of your composition, every quadrant should make you want to like sing and dance, I feel. When it comes to working in color, I'm very intuitive about it. I will just choose a color or two, place in some figures, add some more, go back. I do look for balance. I don't want too much of one color. I want color to be spread out and kind of talk to each other across the way. But I don't know that I have a strict formula. And maybe it's a formula that is more of a gift that I'll discover more about how it works and plays out as I create more. Um, yeah.
So, talk to me a little bit about community. So, I comprehend that within the more structured works, the community was around the materials and gathering them and the conversation that you would have there. And perhaps within the newer abstract, they're all abstract, but you know what I mean, the improvisational works, perhaps the community is based on your experience within the Quilt Barn, and can you talk about negotiating those differences and how? because community is so important to you,
Mhm.
what is it that lifts up or that you intend and try to make sure that you carry through?
Yeah, I mean, I think community in both spaces, more traditional or modern quilting versus art quilting, which the lines blur in so many different shows and venues. It's really the same. I mean, there is that collecting of materials with the upcycled um, projects that have, or the quilts that I've done that use upcycled materials. But, in more traditional and modern quilting, you have quilting guilds and bees, and they'll arrange field trips to go see shows together or go to a museum to see a um, textile art exhibit. And you see that same thing happening with groups of artists. I mean, Nancy Crow's workshops, which um, are probably the closest example I have so far, um, do do have that sense of community. But then you also have artists that come together and establish galleries, do group shows, propose group shows. Um, and there's also local networks of artists like the Studio Art Quilts Associates that has chapters across the country and the world, actually. Um, and things like the Art Quilters Alliance. I recently learned about it. It's in Ohio. Um, that is a network of artists that come together and exhibit their work locally as a group. So it is definitely about, but it's all, both of these communities center around the craft or the art and the creation and the support for one another and appreciation of one another's work. And what's very interesting? My work as an organizer and my personal life outside of quilting tends to limit itself to people who share my values, my political philosophy. I've had relationships through quilting where that isn't the case. And I think it's a very interesting sort of bridge that we need more of in the world, community built around passion and interests.
Wonderful. So I have two more questions. The first one is, you have come to quilting relatively recently, within a little over a decade, and made, leaps and bounds. I mean, you started, came out of the gate knocking it out of the park. How do you recommend folks that are quilt curious go forward?
Oh, I have no idea. I feel like I'm still finding my way. I mean, I would say definitely join a guild. Don't do it on your own. I don't think the idea of being self-taught as Barbara, one of the artists that has influenced me, has said, it's not a badge of honor. Like it's important to learn from others and to be part of a community. So don't rely just on YouTube. Take classes, take workshops, join a guild. The guild I joined in New York City, when I showed my first quilt and my second and third, they were like, I think first they told me, they're like, oh, it's his first quilt. We have to be nice to him. And then I unveiled it and they were like, whoa. But they were always like a source of encouragement and appreciation. Oh, you should think about patterns. Oh, you should submit to shows. So they are in part, and all the people that I've learned from, um, part of the reason that I've been making such advances and been able to explore so many different styles because I've had cheerleaders in the background. So I would say find your cheerleaders, find your people.
Excellent. And then we'll close out with, what are you most excited about right now for your quilting?
Well, the last three pieces I shared with you, I quilted on my new long arm. So I'm very excited, but it makes quilting so much easier. Um, but more than anything, I'm excited to jump into some new shapes. I'm sorry, the exploration of new shapes, and I'm actually using some of Noah's artwork to find inspiration for shape. And I'm working on some black and white studies of those shapes and abstracting them and hope to create some compositions and some pieces that I think speak to who he was and our connection.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again for sharing your arc and your artwork with us. Thank you all for joining us for this artist talk by Anthony Bowman as a part of our programming for Quilt National 2025, the best in contemporary quilts. I'd like to give a special thank you to the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio legislature, and the governor who support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks everyone and have a great day.